Hi, good to see you. While cleaning for a wealthy family, Mukama finds something suspicious and decides to install surveillance cameras. The sight rendered her speechless. Maria, a modest, middle-aged woman who had been a maid for a powerful and affluent city resident for a number of years, started another day of her ordinary life. Maria has witnessed the struggles of severe poverty personally when she was a tiny girl. A Christian orphanage provided her with a roof over her head and other necessities after she was orphaned at an early age. From elementary school in return for helping out with various chores until she was able to go out on her own, with no further educational opportunities available to her. Until an elderly landlady suggested she apply for a position as a reliable maid in the opulent mansion of the esteemed Nunez family, Maria had to work hard at various jobs to make ends meet, including washing clothes for others, cooking in inns, and cleaning offices and houses. Their examinations and interview went well, meticulously researching her background to uncover every aspect before hiring her. Maria eventually succeeded in landing her the highly sought-after job. Despite her still modest and inferior position in comparison to the ever-demanding Mr. and Mrs. Nunez, her life took a dramatic turn for the better from that point on. They had assigned her a small service room adjacent to the kitchen and laundry rooms, where she could sleep for free, but the work of. She had never before experienced such a draining day of cleaning and maintenance from sunrise to sunset. Maria was at least guaranteed stability with her steady paycheck and roof. On this particular day, the maid hurried earlier than usual to meet her boss's demand that she be awake and ready to eat breakfast. No sane person would have dared to disobey the harsh demands of Mr. Nunez, who had to leave for a crucial meeting at his shipping company's headquarters, as he addressed the gentleman before him. Rodolfo Nunez, who was constantly frightening, under Don Rodolfo's stern leadership, the successful maritime firm that his father had inherited had grown to include entire fleets of boats and warehouses across the nation and even overseas by the time he was his son's age. It was on this very day that she would ink a lucrative deal to forge new trade routes with Asian partners, perhaps increasing her already immense riches even further. Maria had constantly exhibited a wary attitude and even dread for the towering figure, who hardly spoke to her and had a piercing, steel-like stare. Before serving his bosses the plentiful breakfast, he meticulously cleaned the imposing window of the living room that overlooked, and every morning, without fail, he checked every corner to make sure the floors were shining and every piece of furniture was perfectly clean. While he was already seated in the spacious dining room, Calle Maria briefly directed his eyes in that direction. In the midst of a heavy silence, broken only by the delicate sound of fine china on a nearby table, the whole Nunez family had gathered for a change of scenery. At one end of the table stood the austere Don Rodolfo, always neatly shaven and dressed in one of his exquisite tailored suits. He read the stock prices of the day with great concentration as Mrs. Elvira, who had eaten very little of her breakfast, spread raspberry jam elegantly on her toast. While praying, Nunez wore exquisite designer clothes and jewelry that symbolized the immense family wealth, and she kept a slim and young appearance. Elvira spent most of her time planning charity events and socializing with friends at poker and bridge games, all in an effort to appear in the social chronicles as the ideal housekeeper and fulfill her decorative duty as a decent wife of high society. Last but not least, the young man Gerardo sat at the opposite end of the expansive table, being the lone son of the Nunez family. He was practically raised by his business father, who was a bit of a tyrant, so he had to go to meetings and learn about the company's problems from an early age, and he would eventually inherit the entire maritime emporium when he was just a few years old. Always, Maria was what stood out about Gerardo was how different he was from his parents. He was quiet during meals, kept to himself most of the time, and only reluctantly looked up from his plate when his dad prodded him. Maria couldn't help but notice his unusually pale and gaunt appearance recently, as if he were ill or worried about something. However, she understood that meddling in her boss's personal matters was none of her concern. On that particular day, Gerardo Lucia appeared considerably thinner than he already was. Custom, he seemed as disturbed as if he had seen a ghost while eating very little. For an instant, he locked eyes with Maria, causing the Mukama to experience a dreadful shiver. His eyes were fixed on a level of agony and despair so profound that he nearly lost control of the glass cleaner he was holding at the time. Because of how suddenly Don Rodolfo sprang up, his chair nearly toppled over onto its back. "You leap in Singapore to the music. My love, bon appetit." He spoke to his wife in a distant tone before planting a kiss on her forehead, nearly as if he weren't there. Gaze fixed on her. Without waiting for a response, the commanding businessman snatched his briefcase and car keys and strode firmly out of the foyer, heading for the subterranean garage in the mornings to go to his workplace. As soon as Gerardo's mother shot him an accusing glance, his cell phone started thumping loudly on the table, breaking the awkward silence. The young man apologized hurriedly and hurried off. Almost immediately after finishing his breakfast, he bolted for his bedroom. Elvira stood up as well, but not before using the tablecloth to fling an insect away from the jam that had accumulated on his plate. He moaned with resignation. Such pests he despised. In his trademark sharp and tidy voice, he summoned Maria with a delicate wave of his jeweled hand and gave her directions for the day's work. "Dear Maria, in the main living room, where the heat is building up, I need you to clean the curtains and vacuum the carpets. Bugs that make me gag the gardener only comes twice a week, and the intense heat destroys the plants in the rear garden, so make sure to water them. I'll be in my bedroom, answering phone calls, so please get some." After finishing her little monologue, Mrs. Nunez hurriedly departed the dining area for her rooms, without even bothering to wait for the employee to respond. She wanted a light lunch of fresh salad in this hot weather, so she didn't want anything heavy. With those abrupt and impolite manners, Maria was well accustomed, lacking in human touch, which had persisted throughout her whole tenure at the home. She wasted no time getting to work, as she always did, with the vigor and care that her client had given her. Being the one thing that characterized Maria, her work brought her immense pride, and she was exceedingly responsible and dedicated about it, regardless of how tedious or monotonous it had become. Hurriedly, she walked out to the backyard to water the plants after she cleaned the main living room and carpets. Tended to the plants in accordance with their wishes, he was always careful not to draw attention to himself, and he was acutely aware of how fortunate he was to have a stable employment and a place to live given his age. Having the luxury of putting that earned privilege at risk while liberally watering the rose bush's foliage with a charming tin watering can that she adored. To Maria's surprise, she caught a glimpse of the back door to the kitchen, which went out to the patio. To her dismay, she found that the door was mysteriously ajar. She was sure she hadn't left it that way just seconds before. The distinctive metallic click of the lock's closing was actually very clear in my memory. Just like every morning, I can't stand to see it. What made her approach all the more peculiar was that she was carrying the watering can as a weapon, ready to use it against any potential intruders on the land. Perhaps it was an impossible thief, but she knew she had to be very careful. She was on the verge of passing out from the strain of the mansion's cutting-edge security systems. Maria cautiously opened the heavy door, which swung slightly on its hinges. She braced herself for the worst, but to her pleasant surprise, there was nothing inside. There was no one in sight. All the pots and tools were still where they normally were on the wall, and there was no indication that someone had searched the pantry or drawers. In fact, after thoroughly searching every nook and cranny, he found nothing out of the ordinary. Explaining that enigmatically open door is a common occurrence. Maria resecured it, feeling a bit perplexed. Maybe she was that exhausted, or maybe she thought Breeze had pushed the door slightly as she opened it. Lately, because his memory was already playing tricks on him from the seemingly endless list of tasks. Regardless, he attempted to minimize its significance and focused on completing the remaining chores once the most demanding cleaning jobs were completed. Following that, he prepared a light lunch for his landlady, as Maria had suggested. Then, he went to the laundry room to continue maintaining the living room's elegant curtains, a task that was quite laborious, but one that she couldn't put off for too long. She poured the neutral detergent into the large basin and delicately set the long cloth of delicate ivory-colored silk into it to soak. She held her breath as her eyes darted to something. Upon noticing a few small stains in one corner of the spacious sink, she examined the fabric meticulously, seeking a logical explanation. The barely noticeable red freckles stood out against the delicate ivory backdrop, and she delicately ran her fingers over them, trying to figure out where they came from. On the little areas, which were likewise marked with a deep red dye, the question of where the blood came from and how it got there remains unanswered. The idea that it could have been his blood was instantly dismissed. He was fully aware that he had not sustained any injuries throughout the past several days. It simply didn't add up that someone from his family or one of his employers would have hurt themselves in the main room, which would explain those unusual stains on the drapes. Then from where on earth did it originate? Furthermore, why was there blood there, as if someone had attempted to? Concealing it beneath the fabric, a shiver went down her spine at the increasing bewilderment and the unsettling sense that something incredibly weird was transpiring in that place without her conscious awareness. The mysterious expression of profound fear and anguish on Gerardo's face flooded back to her. While eating breakfast, the episode involving the open door next to the laundry from hours earlier also came to mind. Something dark was lurking beneath that innocent and lavish facade where he had spent years working, and his heart raced. Suddenly, she was terrified by approaching footsteps, and she reached for her phone to take a picture of the unsettling stains to confirm that she was not dreaming. Whispering stealthily, she swiftly tossed the drape into the sink and continued working, evading the housekeeper's eyes as she sought her. Some fresh linens following the chubby lady's departure clutching the stack of white sheets. After a brief moment of hesitation, Maria decided not to inform her about her discoveries. Worrying other people over something that might just be his confusion was pointless. But he knew in his heart that he should be on guard that day, so he waited to make any hasty judgments. His gut told him that the house had a history of too many strange occurrences. Something extremely odd was concealed under the flawless front of the Núñez family, she yelled out. In her cramped utility room that night, she struggled to get to sleep because she kept thinking about what had happened that morning and how it may have been explained. I ought to let him know. She felt compelled to inform Mr. or Mrs. Núñez or the police about something, but she lacked evidence to support her claims that she was insane or suffering from stress or exhaustion. Worrying her employers would be futile, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. Confined inside, if only he could verify that his fears were genuine and not just irrational, he would feel considerably better the next day. After a lengthy night of very disturbed sleep, Maria woke up feeling much more stressed than before. He tried to temporarily set aside his concerns and get ready to start his routine with fresh vigor, all because of those bizarre happenings from the previous day that were racing through his thoughts. Swiftly getting dressed and making his modest room somewhat presentable for the following hours, he set out for the kitchen with determination to whip up the show-stopping breakfast for her superiors. She nearly encountered Gerardo on her morning commute, as she did every day. Gerardo appeared to have had a rough night too, considering how thin Lucia looked and the black circles under her eyes. Such things would cause concern in any entity. Even though Maria and Gerardo greeted the young man warmly, he remained unfazed and kept walking with his head down and his feet nearly dragging from the weight of his burden. Maria couldn't help but observe that he was dressed identically from the previous day, as if he hadn't even changed into his pajamas. He spent the night in the kitchen, cooking bacon and making freshly squeezed orange juice, but his mind kept returning to the enigma of the unusual stains. He needed to know if they were. He started to get an idea when he was setting the table for breakfast, but he wasn't sure if the ideas were genuine or just in his head. Since he would have to go back to the laundry room to wait for the curtains to dry, he would use that opportunity to give them a thorough inspection and put his fears to rest. Shortly after, as the men departed from the table to attend to their individual responsibilities under Maria's watchful eye, she ran frantically to the laundry room, her pulse pounding, and opened the dryer before the cycle was complete. She laid out the long silk curtains on a table and eagerly examined each one, looking for the reddish stains. Sure enough, they were there, so plain and obvious, sending a nasty shiver down her spine. There was no need to dismiss the sight of the hedgehog hairs on her neck as a delusion. It seemed like someone had made an effort to remove the blood stain. However, a few droplets had seeped into the fabric. She was resolute in her mission to discover the source of the suspicious individual and needed to quickly uncover the truth behind this mystery. Using a regular soaking swab and a few drops of the substance, She scrubbed the stain vigorously to remove any traces on the curtain. She had to finish quickly because her job would be in danger if she was caught snooping around on unrelated matters. She could even face theft accusations. From now on, she had to be extremely careful, but she was determined to solve the mystery until the end. Maria devoted the following several days to her regular tasks, taking note of each. A keen awareness of his surroundings in the initial days, he didn't see anything significant beyond the normal concealment, and the icy connections between the Nunes Gerardo maintained persisted, but anything out of place could provide new information about the house's happenings. He appeared unwell and appeared completely engrossed in his food and his world. The house gentleman and the rest of the servants showed no signs of alarm or worry that anything out of the ordinary was transpiring right in front of their eyes. The second worrisome occurrence only occurred on the 5th day of intense undercover observation for Maria. As she was raking up some dead leaves on the terrace, she became startled by the sound of a barely audible moan emanating from the backyard. The sound was coming from a particularly isolated spot, where an abandoned shed engulfed in creepers stood. Abandoned her broom in her pursuit of the source of the noise, which she suspected might be coming from that underappreciated part of the land. The groaning abruptly ceased, much to her amazement. It came from within the rundown structure that the gardener now uses as a storage room for his tools and sacks of soil or fertilizers. This time it was slightly louder but still feeble and muted. "Excuse me?" On the other hand, who might be producing such noises? He mustered up the nerve to test the ground and whisper in a voice that was just a little bit shaking as Maria's dread grew. After a few anxious seconds of stillness, he finally spoke up. "There's someone there. Please, answer me. Don't be scared. I came to assist you." Their anticipation for the return of life appeared to go on indefinitely. Seeking a method to peer inside, he started to encircle the shed. At that moment, he beheld a little side window nearly concealed by the foliage. Standing on tiptoe, he peered. At first, a hesitant peep was made, as if to catch a glimpse. Once her eyes adapted to the dim light, she could discern patterns on the grimy floor. Suppressing a muted scream of terror, she swiftly covered her mouth with both hands, curled up, and made a gesture to hush herself. Gerardo Maria was immediately identified by a little figure. In order to seek assistance, she had to gather all her might not to flee in terror. For the second time, she looked intently to rule out hallucinations. Nonetheless, there was no denying the rather disheveled blonde locks, and the eye didn't understand the garments. The young Nunez was obviously in a bad situation. He was bound hand and foot, his jaw was taped shut, and his pain was so great that he could hardly scream. But what on earth was going on there? He bounded around the humble building seeking an entrance. Finally, she located a door that was only open with a broken padlock. Using the gardener's tongs, she managed to force the latch while holding her breath in order to aid the youngster. To save Gerardo, she had come prepared to face any threat, but her immense surprisingly, no one else was present except for the frail young man, who remained bound to the chilly concrete floor and bore the marks of silent sobbing, possibly caused by fear and agony. Maria interrupted abruptly. Freeing his hands and feet from their shackles, he cut the gag from his lips. As the distraught mom sat him down and patted him on the cheek to get him to react, the shocked kid trembled like a leaf in the wind and seemingly remained in a state of shock. "My God, young Gerardo is fine. What the hell did they do to him?" she asked. His eyes welled up with tears as he abruptly fixed them on Maria's face. As he sobbed furiously, he pushed himself on top of her. Attempting to articulate a description, "Maria, I am eternally grateful that you tracked me down. I felt like I was about to pass away. My folks were back at it again. Their intense animosity toward me baffles me." Upon hearing it, Maria's rage consumed her completely, yet she mustered the will to keep her cool. He did his best to console her while she sobbed, drying her tears and whispering encouraging words into her ear while they remained in close hug, all for the sake of the unfortunate youngster who was now taking out his pent-up pain on her. In an effort to alleviate his anxiety, she almost crawled with him to his room, where she served him cookies and sweet tea and told him to rest while she went to get pain medication for his wrists. He needed time to change clothes after experiencing such a traumatic event. The young man's face turned red, and he looked confused and panicked as he hurried off to get the medication. I am aware that it is extremely important for Maria to try to learn more about what happened to young Gerardo. Impending, and perhaps he is reluctant to discuss the matter. Nonetheless, I must ascertain the precise circumstances surrounding his incarceration and the brutal manner in which his parents abandoned him. As you mentioned, I am your friend and would never betray you. Therefore, I implore you to reveal the truth. Gerardo, after hesitating for a while, he broke down into sobs once more. My father caught me trying to sneak out of the house last night. As punishment, he locked me up all day without food or anything, he said, his body shaking as if struck by an electric charge. Drunkenness had a devastating effect on me. Dear Maria, please, you must rescue me from this place. I was about to die before making that devastating plea. Maria's heart broke as she tenderly ran her fingers through his hair, assuring him that she would be there for him no matter what. With a kiss on the forehead, she slipped out to find the tablets, wiping away her own tears of despair as she went down the hall. After then, she had no more reservations about the parents' savage treatment of their own son. Something genuinely evil must have transpired. Within those graceful walls, she vowed to uncover the truth and rescue the helpless boy from the clutches of those cruel creatures before it was too late. Nothing could sway her from her resolve. That evening, once Maria had ensured Gerardo was comfortably sedated with a moderate painkiller, she discreetly made her way to the never-visited attic situated above the private wing, which housed the rooms of the Núñez family. Her watch indicated that it was about the break of dawn, time when deep slumber engulfs even the most alert. He cautiously placed the small device that had acquired a miniature spy camera with a built-in microphone and night vision, which a friend had gifted him for after purchasing it at a reasonable price. He discreetly attached it to a dark nook behind a beam using adhesive tape. While staring at the front door of the master bedroom, he entered a series of commands into the portable modem. By connecting it to the camera and activating the continuous recording feature, she could now record anything suspicious and use it as conclusive evidence. Additionally, she could remotely watch Núñez's movements using the app on her phone. No matter what happened, she would always look out for Gerardo's best interests. She could prove to those haughty wealthy men what a selfless servant is capable of doing for love by putting herself in harm's way. Maria devoted herself wholeheartedly to her espionage assignment in the days that followed. He flawlessly carried out all of his duties while undercover, making sure not to neglect any of his usual household chores so as not to draw attention to himself. Despite having his heart racing and his mind focused on deciphering the audiovisual footage secretly recorded by the attic's hidden camera, he devoted every spare moment to closely watching his phone screen, mentally noting everything that was happening outside the Núñez main bedroom. As an extra measure, he had further installed an application to save the footage to the cloud instead of relying on his mobile device, just in case. The first few hours of recording were filled with dull, uninteresting scenes, such as the housekeeper cleaning, a maid removing linens to wash, or Mrs. Elvira coming and going in her formal attire, likely for social engagements or card games with friends. Maria didn't see the first unsettling scene following Elvira until the afternoon of the third day. Returned from having had tea with her lady-in-waiting and lay down for a while reading her phone, suddenly her husband abruptly came in with fury's face contorted. Opening the door with a smash, "Elvira, where the hell did you store the documents that I clearly requested you to file?" Concerning the acquisition of the shipyard, he lost it and threw a floor lamp to the floor, revealing that he had nearly lost a multimillion-dollar business in front of the board of directors today due to your ineffectiveness. Surprisingly, the woman got up from the table as soon as she stepped inside. The bed, obviously accustomed to such violent tantrums, reacted with a hint of fear. She seemed to be quite familiar with that forceful treatment, but she remained composed as she pointed to the dressing room, where she kept critical papers in a built-in safe. In a flash, she entered a series of codes onto the digital board, unlocking the little vault. Unprompted, she handed him a rather yellow envelope bearing the emblem of an unknown marine organization. It was violently ripped from his hands by the insane businessman. Holding it briefly in his hands, he held his breath until he confirmed that they were the missing documents. Then, without further ado, he withdrew like an angry beast, muttering insults but not hitting her. Maria, who had anticipated that outcome, thought, damned animal, clenching her fists. The slaves clearly knew what to do in these situations of abuse. They didn't even bat an eye when they heard curse words and shouts. Otherwise, they would have quit in disgust at being treated so badly. Beneath reproach, she had no intention of doing nothing, even though the victims may have been too afraid or pitted to report the abuse. Just then, Gerardo showed up, calling timidly to his mother's room. The kid walked somewhat bent over with a black eye and a fairly haggard appearance after the horrific beating that his father had given him days before. Seeing him in such deplorable situation broke Maria's heart into 1,000 pieces. I don't think the beggar deserved any of that sacrifice. He was only a confused adolescent, Mom. "'Cause I'm getting ready to go out, Gerardo," he said with a cracked voice as he timidly made his way into the luxurious bedroom. The Vera gave him a scornful glance and reacted with contempt as he applied his makeup in front of the enormous mirror. He responded coldly, playing it down, telling the Mukama to assist with everything you needed and telling me to leave him alone. In that instant, Maria was overcome with rage and a sense of powerlessness to the point where she nearly violently flung her cell phone against the wall. It would have been different if she hadn't kept recording. Impassive, the Núñez were undoubtedly soulless monsters, and the woman's moral obligation was to confront them in order to rescue Gerardo from that ordeal. However, she required more convincing proof before she would run to console and defend her son, who appeared defenseless and injured. Instead, she appeared irritated by his presence, as if he were an annoyance. Starting with the day he flung a glass of brandy, the maid found additional proof of Don Rodolfo's aggressive personality in the days that followed. Gerardo and his mother also made occasional appearances on camera, talking about their lives, until she slapped him so hard that he sobbed hysterically and went to his room. The butler's out-of-place comment turned the curtains in the main living room on. Every fresh outrage that Maria observed in those movies made him furious, yet he, with his cash and a long-lost buddy who may owe him a favor, he was able to hold himself as he planned the boy's escape. While she considered her options, she could utilize him to conceal the young man. But she could not move too quickly should they be found out. During the early hours of the morning on the 7th day of surveillance, Maria was present for the most intense scene that had occurred thus far. Out of the blue, he heard commotion in the grand hallway leading to the majestic bedroom. To his astonishment, he witnessed a very distressed Don Rodolfo almost pulling a terrified Gerardo by the hair as the insane man yelled out a litany of obscenities. After opening and slamming the door, the subject violently shoved the adolescent onto the bed. Without uttering a word, he snatched a bright Monty knife from his pocket and sprang toward the helpless youngster, brandishing it in his direction. The incident would remain etched in Maria's memory forever. The next thing he knew, it was a swift blow to the neck, and he nearly passed out on the spot. As a horrified Gerardo watched helplessly, Don Rodolfo brutally tore his son's shirt with the knife. The insane man was slicing her chest and arms as he roared like a ferocious beast, despite her cries of agony and pleading with him to stop. Excessive bleeding stained the linens. The horrific scene from the movie rendered Maria speechless with terror. Uncontrollably, tears streamed down his face as he shrieked with dread. As he listened to his little friend's cries for help, he silently hoped that someone would come to his rescue from Calvary, where the immense pressure was making it impossible for him to move. Suddenly, the door swung open and Elvira, inconsolable, stormed into the room. She heard terrible screams and saw the horrific scene. Elvira yelled at her husband, "Stop!" until he finally removed the bloody knife from his hands. In his maniacal tantrum, he killed the boy and shattered a mirror as he slammed his son against it. A somewhat agitated Don Rodolfo eventually calmed down. His wife yelled at him in distress as he stormed out, slamming the door behind him, while he snorted like a wild bull and stared down at Gerardo, who was sobbing in a corner. The cuts were so deep that the teenager's face, limbs, and body were all covered in blood. The wounds appeared to be superficial, which was a relief. Upon seeing the housekeeper enter to assist him, Maria pressed the screen off the screen. Despite trembling all over, she continued recording and eventually had to sit down to avoid throwing up all over the floor. He had no idea that Mr. Núñez would resort to trying to kill Gerardo, his own son, while knowing that he was a violent and merciless guy after watching the horrific event firsthand. That night, he toiled away in agony at his inaction in stopping the brutal aggressiveness. Visions of his young friend, covered in blood, kept popping into his head, and he couldn't sleep. He had to have stepped in somehow. Without fail, the following day he would figure out a covert means to rescue him from that predicament. She rushed to Gerardo's chambers in the wee hours of the morning, acting as if she had a tray of food, to confirm that he had been cured and to assess his mental health, much to his relief. After the young man got his wounds healed and was feeling somewhat better following the nightmare, they sobbed together for a long time, releasing all of their pent-up pain and terror. For being the one person who truly cared about him on that particular day, Gerardo expressed his deepest gratitude to her. Maria earnestly assured him that she would swiftly remove him from that place, whatever of the cost. She would whisk him away to a distant land where his nasty parents could never inflict harm upon him again. In the days that followed, his attempts to convince her failed miserably. He warned her that he posed a serious threat and wished her no harm. The enraged Mr. Nunez would lash out at anyone who dared to cross him, and the staff were left to face his never-ending barrage of insults and cries of frustration. Neither he nor anyone else could challenge him. Maria stepped up her spying and evidence gathering since she knew that Gerardo or another staff member will be targeted in one of his uncontrolled fury assaults by him at some point. All the while, she was quietly fortifying her bonds with her loved ones. The perfect person to discreetly remove Gerardo from the city without anybody noticing would be his friend Camilo, a transporter who owed him his life for tending to him years ago after he had a horrific accident, from which he had miraculously recovered. Believed, whisking him away to study under a false identity with a distant relative in a different province. Fearing that Don Rodolfo had found out about her escape plot, Maria hurriedly went to his office when she was abruptly summoned one afternoon, disrupting her routine. After a gentle knock, the subject icy-facedly motioned for him to come inside. Upon opening the door, he found the commanding individual positioned by the window, facing away from him, engaged in a phone conversation. In an intimidating manner. With a hint of intimidation, Maria said, "Sir, could you please tell me how I can assist you?" When someone abruptly ended the conversation upon seeing her arrive. The man hesitated before turning to face her, his expression expressing his decision to say the words, "Maria, I will be," with a chilling coldness that sent shivers down her spine. "I hope this stays between us because I want what's best for you, and I'll be very explicit in my instructions," he said with an unsettling tone. Anticipating the worst, the woman could only nod slightly in response to Don Rodolfo's. By abandoning her in a state of frozen terror, he proved that Gerardo was in far more peril than he had anticipated. Now that his life was on the line, his mission to rescue him had taken on an air of urgency. From tomorrow forward, it is imperative that you promptly deliver him breakfast upon waking up. Gerardo to his room and informed him that you are personally responsible for delivering him meals straight from the kitchen. I will ensure that no one else, including you, comes into contact with him alone. Simply responding, "These are my orders," will suffice if he were to question you. Ensure his well-being. I have only ever been forthright. Maria briefly shut her eyes as she attempted to comprehend the terrifying consequences of that peculiar request. It was crystal clear that they planned to isolate Gerardo, maybe with drugs or in prison for something evil that was imminent. Mr. Nunez wanted complete control over him, so he couldn't escape or ask for help. Everything fell into place, and the teenager was about to be subjected to a horrific act. If he could manage it, he could even kill him with style. Under the pretense of being very serious, Maria vowed to follow that command exactly as written. For the sake of the boy's health, she even offered to change his medicine by adding more painkillers. Trusting in the devotion of someone he viewed as little more than a servant, the guy grinned in delight at her initiative. That deceitful confidence would be exploited by her. It seems like people are aware of how to look out for the interests of this respected family, and you seem to be a careful woman, so it works out well for you, Maria. I assume that you are well versed in the potential consequences for individuals who. I have faith in your wisdom, he said as a subtle threat, so if you ever consider leaving, I will shield you and young Gerardo from harm. Rest assured, I will keep a close eye on him. I am on high alert, so nothing bad can happen to him. She spoke with assurance, her confidence shining through. That's how I feel. The man was pleased with his subordinate's work and knew he could not afford to play dirty, so he ended by saying, "Leave now. I'll call you if I need anything else." That was his belief, at least after he escaped that uncomfortable scenario. Encounter with Mr. Nunez. Maria wasted no time, knowing that she had a limited amount of time before they implemented a sinister plot against Gerardo. Now that they had chosen to isolate him, potentially there was a race against time to rescue him. She could not afford to make a mistake, so as soon as she had the chance, she sneaked into the garage to make a secret call to Camilo, his friend. She asked him to meet at a downtown cafe that very afternoon to discuss the dangerous escape plan and enlist Camilo's assistance in transferring the boy to A. He agreed to meet at a somewhat isolated table in the local Modesto a few hours later, worried that no one in the residential neighborhood would recognize her, because he needed to get away from the city as soon as possible after noticing her changed tone. After that, Maria gave him a brief update. Without going into too much detail, Gerardo's horrible predicament and his justified worry that his parents were plotting to eliminate him in a devious way, taking advantage of his separation from the family, were revealed to him by his dear buddy, the sensitive circumstance. The good Camilo and the servants all eagerly volunteered to lend a hand. He was deeply grateful to Maria for caring for him following the accident that caused him to lose a limb, offering him both emotional and financial support. They had been like brothers for a long time. He now has a thriving transportation firm with a fleet of trucks. He could give them one and even go with them to the border without anyone noticing, since it's normal practice in their industry. They maintained contact after discussing the intricate plan specifics. To take immediate action to remove the young man from the house the moment Maria perceived an imminent threat. Waiting for her signal to leave, Camilo assured her that he had a safe escape route planned to a cousin's cabin in the mountains, where they could hide for a reasonable amount of time away from everything. The next 2 days were incredibly difficult for the Mukama, who had to act completely normally in front of the staff while inside she was overwhelmed with anxiety and pain. She even had to coordinate with the housekeeper to take herself. She would sneak the food trays into Gerardo's bedroom 3 times a day, taking care not to be seen or followed in accordance with the stringent regulations. During those brief minutes alone with the boy, she would encourage him to stay calm and have a positive attitude. She secretly hoped they were doping him as he became noticeably more indifferent and miserable after that strange period of solitude. Sleep eluded the unfortunate lad, held captive by the crippling terror of the unknown as he wonders what his insane parents have planned for him. As he embraced Maria, he pleaded with her multiple times, in between sobbing, pleading with her not to abandon him. Seeing him in such a pitiful state, seeking solace and safety, broke the woman's heart and strengthened her resolve to do whatever it took to save him. She had saved up what little she had and even bought a few items of clothing, claiming she was going to donate them when the time came so she could escape. As a precaution, she now always had a little needle containing a potent sedative in her purse. In order to let Gerardo escape unscathed, she had to utilize it beside him. She hoped she wouldn't need to use it, but she figured it was wise to be ready just in case. On the morning of the 4th day following Mr. Nunez's menacing instructions to isolate her son, Maria got the call that numerous Camilo, her accomplice, was waiting on the agreed-upon path for her rescue signal when she thought the crucial moment to act had come after a little delay. She hoped, but she frightened, with all her being. Conversation. The maid abruptly ended communication after reaching an agreement on certain practical aspects. Her heart was pounding, and she felt the moment had arrived to take a chance. She had to think of a method to get Gerardo out either that night or the following day, with no room for mistake in anything she did. He hoped, at the very least, that his complicated escape plan would be successful since he was clever and level-headed. The life of the unfortunate youngster was in his hands. In the midst of his often monotonous domestic duties, sneaky excursions to keep the young man under control, who was already delirious from the powerful drug or medication they had given him to keep him in an almost catatonic state. Witnessing his anguish and confusion tore at his soul, intensifying his determination to keep him out of harm's way as much as possible. It was almost midnight when Maria mustered up the bravery to slip back into the semi-conscious cells. Cold perspiration beaded on Gerardo's brow, but for some reason, she felt stronger and braver than before. As she made her way down the dimly lit hallway that led to the boy's bedroom, she humbly prayed for divine intervention. The youngster lay on his bed, half sleeping, his heart racing as he held his breath and attempted to calm his racing heart. He had mentally prepared himself to inject the potent medicine into his arm, and in an instant, the sedative took effect, sending the youngster into a profound sleep from which he would not awaken for a few minutes. Just long enough to rescue him and gain the upper hand before the inevitable scandal that follows once Gerardo was rendered unconscious. He reached down and placed one of his frail arms over his neck. Then, firmly gripping Gerardo by the waist, he lifted him up to carry him, nearly dragging him through the dreary runner. She may have been little and a little bit old, but the fear of being found gave her an extra burst of energy, and the journey to the rear service exit felt like it would go on forever in between snorts and, on more than one occasion, Gerardo was on the brink of collapse as he stumbled, doing his best to hold the comatose teenager's dead weight. "Hold on a bit longer, my darling. We are nearly out of this terrible place." If only his heroic savior had been more determined. After what felt like an interminable ordeal, Maria finally succeeded in escaping towards the street via a service back room, as she continued to cautiously make her way through the seemingly endless hallway while carrying the youngest member of the Núñez family. As her heart was about to explode from trying to evade the surveillance cameras, she felt a tremendous sense of relief when she suddenly saw her friend Camillo's cargo truck parked a few blocks ahead at the agreed-upon area, with the lights off, as if to avoid detection. The courageous woman, despite the weariness from the long trip, continued onwards to the car after she had stabilized, knowing that the few minutes that passed felt like an eternity because of how quickly they passed. She and her accomplice had successfully scaled the loading platform. With the assistance of his loyal companion, who was watching over them with bated breath, Camillo skillfully navigated the night streets towards the highway, avoiding detection by the patrols. Meanwhile, Alivi Gerardo slept soundly on Maria's legs, and she continued to gently kiss his forehead. Despite her inability to comprehend that they had successfully rescued him, tears of joy streamed down his face. Cheeks after half an hour of peacefully escaping the city of horror and persecution, they were back on the road to the mountains. After overcoming the hardest part, Maria knew that the nightmare was far from over. They needed to get to the promised hiding place quickly and stay hidden there for an endless amount of time until things calmed down enough to process the boy's permanent change of address and name, allowing him to start over. Serenely escaped the relentless pursuit of his wicked parents, Gerardo waited until the break of dawn to encounter a Grogi. Awakened, bewildered, and unsure of his current location, he appeared disoriented as he shifted from side to side, until finally, his gaze met the beaming, very proud eyes of Maria. "Do not weep, my child. You are now entirely protected from those wicked ones." However, the realization of what that courageous woman had ventured to do for him brought him to tears, and he was unable to control them. As she embraced him tightly, her voice quivered with emotion, assuring him that they would never be able to harm him again. Seeing the adorable little kid she had grown to love after viewing him in safety had been well worth the jitters. Put an end to every affront that she endured in that desolate area. The little girl had been secretly housed in a little shelter among the mountains owned by a distant relative of Camillo's who had provided her with food and shelter for a few days. As a simple yet sublime way to relax after the escape, the entourage enjoyed a hot cup of chocolate in front of the rustic fireplace. They watched the flames crackle, illuminating Gerardo's sweet face as he slept peacefully on the lap, exhausted but finally at peace. It was well worth the torture for Mary to behold the little angel of light, who was so innocent and pure, and she would cherish her forever, after all the suffering she had endured. She would spend her final days remembering the helpless animal to whom fate had guided her, so that she may be a mother figure in its worst hours. For the tiny party staying in that rustic lodge tucked away in the distant highlands, the following 2 days went by in a strange mix of relaxation and anticipation, like a species on its honeymoon. In order to try to learn more about the reaction that had led to the escape of Camillo had to take occasional absences. Succeeding Los Núñez, not to mention if the authorities were trying to track him down. Maria and Gerardo, meantime, chose to stay indoors and not receive any outside news. They spent their time talking and taking walks in the beautiful jungle, where the young guy could finally feel free after being enslaved and humiliated his whole life. Like a feral animal headed for the slaughtering, they sensed an unbreakable connection as family that went beyond words and embraced each other deeply. Independently of any familial ties, fate had brought them together at that pivotal juncture to impart the wisdom and fortitude needed to conquer any obstacle, no matter how formidable. Their chemistry, backed by unwavering trust and love, was winning over both of their hearts to the point where it felt like they had spent their entire lives together, rather than the few years separated by the artificial barrier that had been imposed between employers and employees up until that point. The only thing that separated them was a warm night after a long talk as confidants. During that talk, they both emotionally exposed themselves to each other, sharing their deepest fears and hopes for the future. Little did they know that what started as a chaste goodnight kiss would turn into a love affair that was both innocent and captivating, filled with uncomfortable blushes and nervous laughter due to the unprecedented nature of the situation for both of them. They both made the decision to surrender to the emerging emotion at that same shared moment, subtly offering one another without ever pushing a caress, but also not rejecting contact. They let things follow their natural rhythm almost as if they had consciously decided to set aside any prior preconception. Little did they know, the boundaries began to melt until two souls were joined in an inextricable web of mutual aid, comprehension, and cooperation. Aside from the tangible, they had transformed into. They belonged to each other without conditions, reproaches, or possessiveness, and they did it despite knowing that the harsh reality and the weight of a prejudiced society would eventually separate them, as if that fortunate encounter had been a perfect dream. In the ground cable of the other, there was cloth of tears and words of encouragement, support, and the one who pushed him when he lacked the strength to continue. In that brief but exquisite moment of bliss, their joined spirits relished it. Remaining anonymous, isolated from any outside influence, the intensity of their mutual need and the complementarity of their personalities led Maria and neither of them to worry too much about the uncertain future. They treasured every moment together as if it were a priceless gift, for fate had already decided it was time for them to part ways, to forge forth along likely divergent roads. But they would always remember those glorious days when they were overjoyed and filled to the brim. The unexpected entrance of Camillo brought with him those. The tiny group was caught unawares by urgent news, which sent them crashing back to the harsh reality they had escaped from during their brief romance in that mountain cottage. There was some early disarray, but after that, they got themselves settled into the vintage transporter's van, which was hauling only, leaving only the bare minimum behind, removing any trace that may subsequently associate the objects with that location should a police raid occur, but not. It appeared as though someone was still trying to trace their steps. Given the gravity of the allegations, it was prudent to play it safe. Our fugitives continued their treacherous journey into the hostile mountainous region in total secrecy, fearing no one would suspect a trap. They were hoping that another cabin, owned by a woodcutter friend of Camillo, would provide them with the safety they needed for a few weeks as they planned their next move. Arduous and seemingly endless trek, navigating the steep rural roads while attempting to remain undetected at the very infrequent intersections with other vehicles or villages. At last, after trudging through the darkness for what seemed like an eternity, they reached their new home, a weathered cave, made of wood that had weathered the years and the jungle's wrath. Upon initial observation, it appeared that their new lodging did not provide the bare necessities for an extended stay. However, without hesitation or argument, they hastily made preparations to settle in, believing that it could offer them shelter and, more significantly, the chance to remain anonymous in that isolated, God-forsaken corner. Yet, upon entering, they were able to confirm the house's abandonment status after a brief examination of the rundown property. There was filth and dampness for a long time, and there were a lot of damaged or rotting chairs, and the lounge chairs were in a terrible state due to leaks from the semi-extruded roof, which was clearly shown by the thick layer of dust, cobwebs, and excrement that had accumulated in the corners. Despite this disheartening scene, the trio made a conscious effort to find the positive aspects. With what little they had, They made do with making lanterns out of oiled rags and lighting a fire in the fireplace, which thankfully had a draft, so they could at least keep the. As the dreary prevailing darkness began to lift, a slightly warmer and more welcoming ambience took over. Camillo briefly returned to the truck to retrieve the food and blankets they had brought, as they had planned to spend the night outside in the event of an unexpected event. Fortunately, they had saved some of their drinking water, so they were prepared. Therefore, after assembling a couple of decaying bunks in the room with the least amount of damage and mopping, we were able to make do with a few makeshift beds, a small amount to make the floor passable. Finally, huddling under an old blanket, the three fugitives felt well served. They had been mentally and physically drained from their long trek avoiding invisible threats. Maria found Gerardo sound asleep on her lap. She covered his dreams as she ran her fingers through his hair in a nearly parental motion. His expression betrayed a trace of worry and anxiety regarding the consequences that chance could bring to that particular scenario. Erupting scene after staring at her in quiet contemplation for a while, Camillo finally spoke up, shattering the heavy stillness that had settled over the foreboding ambience, partially cast by the flickering light of the fireplace that was on the verge of extinguishing. "You don't need to suffer, my dear. You'll notice that we'll find a way to escape regardless. They will be okay here as long as we figure out how to get them over the border without incident, and I will keep an eye on the investigation's development so that we don't have to kidnap them again." As he gently grasped his hand to reassure him, "Don't let the fear of the future stop you from enjoying the here and now." Before leading him into the wolf's mouth, he spoke softly. Maria looked at Camillo's effort with an expression of deep gratitude. He was positive that his comments would bring a sense of peace and encouragement. It served no purpose for him to wallow in self-pity about potential dangers that had not yet materialized. He would be better served by directing his attention toward making the most of his time with his loved one and on. Discover potential answers to the challenging problem they encountered following a short discussion of their views on what to do next and the finalization of certain logistical elements of the journey to the border to legalize new identities that Camillo processed with his local contacts. The hours slipped away with no even more unusual for that area at the time was the distant sound of nocturnal birdsong and the hooting of the wind among the ancient weeping willows nearby, which added an extra layer of uniqueness to the scene. First light the wan light of a setting sun the following day. Our small group wasted no time getting ready to leave those hostile lands. With just a small bag of clothing and almost empty gas tank, they refueled to the limit to avoid refueling in areas where surveillance could be taking place. Immediately after exchanging brief words on the way to the closest city, they set off in the same unstable van they had arrived in the day before. Camillo drove very carefully, keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity, all the while Maria and Gerardo slept on the blankets in the cargo area, like two wanted criminals. Once they arrived at the bus terminal, after taking careful detours to ensure there was no pursuit, they continued, last but not least, to covertly purchase 3 second-class tickets under the guise of someone else en route to the country's northern regions. Attempting to cross the border through an informal crossing that was nearby and present in adjacent regions, the journey by land to the border was both draining and upsetting for the family as they sought refuge in Camillo's distant aunt's house while they completed legalizing Gerardo's and Maria's new names and papers. Eventually, they decided to settle down somewhere. Just Camillo disembarked at the short technical halt to stretch his legs, while the rest of the little retinue of outlaws rode in complete but vigilant silence for the most part. Purchased some fresh food, vigilantly watching for any peculiarity that could signal the threat of persecution. Thankfully, everything appeared to be in order after nearly 2 days of relentless rattling along winding rural routes filled with curves, potholes, and precipices. A subtle picturesque sign announced upon reaching El Cabra they were just a few hours from their final goal, as per Camillo's predictions. This was following a quick stopover for replenishment, and they stood up and drank hot coffee to combat the dreadful morning cold. The first indications of civilization were becoming more apparent as they resumed their march, suggesting that they were gradually reaching the first stable communities in the area. Their arrival at their destination was delayed until after midday. Camillo's aunt's house was a large, traditional country-style home with reddish tiles that had faded with the years and thick, blackened timbers that supported a wide, Perched precariously on one side of the main entryway, a verdant and weathered walnut tree added an aura of nostalgic heritage to the space brimming with antiques. As soon as the rundown truck made its audible arrival down the access road, the owner, a charming old lady with pleasant manners, sped across the entrance threshold. Stepping confidently, though slightly unsteady due to his several chronic ailments, he rushed up to embrace her with genuine interest, then met her sympathetic eyes. "Please come. My children will be secure here for as long as they need till they can continue their journey." The young couple that approached after the exuberant meeting timidly. "Their presence in the house brings me great joy. While you're exhausted, come have some delicious hot Creole barbecue." That little act was enough to replenish optimism in the disheartened group after the long journey. The charming matron remarked with an endearing blend of formality and informality, sounding like a folksy voice. Gerardo and Maria had a short yet meaningful conversation. Expression of comprehension and cooperation after such a painful voyage. They understood each other's feelings at that very moment. Thanks, relief, and they didn't even need to speak. After the darkest of nights, a new dawn was taking shape for each of them, and that brought with it optimism that only a select handful managed to accomplish.